So this is where we left off yesterday, talking about the beginnings of the Cold War, and we were specifically looking at the United States' policy of containment, which we're going to see it, kind of tweaked and looked at and used a little bit differently by different presidential administrations. Some of it will interpret that a little bit more aggressively than others, and so forth. However, ultimately, this is the cornerstone of the United States' foreign policy, particularly as it regarded communism, that we have to keep communism contained, not allow it to spread any further. The Truman Doctrine was kind of similar to that, but not just suggesting communism the United States had to contain, but that the United States needed to help any free people that were fighting any kind of oppression. And both of those things were further validated by the Marshall Plan, which was the investment in Europe's economic recovery, which in large part was an attempt to contain communism by supporting economic recovery so that countries would be less likely to fall to communism if they were in a better economic situation. People would not have been or as the United States may have seen it, wouldn't have been as enthralled by communist governments coming to power, promising, economic help, and also to keep the Soviet Union. That's a really big part of it, is keeping the Soviet Union out of helping out those countries. So we've got to step in and help these countries out economically and provide them with loans and help them rebuild. Because if we don't, then the Soviet Union will. And if the Soviet Union does, then they will fall to communism, and communism continues to spread. So particularly after more Eastern European countries, particularly Czechoslovakia, when they fall to communism, let me fix this, when they fell to communism about 1948, that gave more support for the Marshall Plan, and that was seen as more necessary, and it passed through Congress, although it further alienates the Soviets. So that's where we finished up yesterday. Now, let's talk about the issue of Germany specifically. Now,
teachers, please pardon this interruption. Students, if you ride bus 14-8 with Miss Amanda Irvin, you will now ride 001 today. Again, if you ride 14-8 with Miss Amanda Irvin, today you will ride 001. Again, that is 001.
So if you remember, Germany, as a result of the Yalta Conference, what did they decide about Germany and that territory after Germany surrendered? Yes.
Germany would get split between the United States, Soviet Union.
Right. That it would be divided up into those 4 different occupation zones. Now that was meant to be temporary. Now the other thing is that the capital of Germany, Berlin, which sits in the Soviet zone. So according to that first part of the agreement, the German capital would have been completely in the Soviet zone. And that was something that the United States and Britain really did not want, for the Soviets to have complete control over the capital. So it was decided that not only would all of Germany be divided into those zones, but Berlin would be divided into zones as well. So you've got zones within a zone. So within that one city, it was divided into an American zone, a French zone, a Soviet zone, a British zone. So all of that's within that Soviet bloc in that northeastern corner of Germany, but then the city of Berlin itself is divided up as well. Now, again, all of that was meant to be temporary. The whole idea was that this was just about providing that stability while everybody kind of gets back on their feet. Berlin, which, by the way, in 1945 was practically destroyed in most or in a lot of parts of it. So they needed, stability and assistance and all of that. But it all, of course, ends up being permanent, or at least semi-permanent for decades anyway, because eventually the British zone, the American zone, the French zone, those start to consolidate, because those 3 countries, agreed on how those governments should be set up, and instated or supported democratic governments and allowed those governments to start taking over control. But what do you think happened in the Soviet zone? Right, communism starts to take over there. So instead of a unified Germany, as was the original plan, Germany ends up divided semi-permanently, at least permanent for the time being. And so you end up with two different Germanys. You have East Germany and West Germany. That become two officially separate countries from each other. So Germany, during the Cold War, there's two of them, literally. West Germany is the democratic Germany, the Germany that was ruled by, elected governments, democratic governments, and that was supported by the West, by the democracies of the West, such as the United States, Britain, and others. But then you end up with East Germany. That was the communist bloc. That was communist Germany. And so those people are divided quite literally. Now, again, Berlin was divided as well, and that ends up being semi-permanent also until the end of the Cold War. All of this, of course, angered Stalin. He didn't want those zones to be, merged together. He didn't want Germany to be unified because the Soviets, led by Stalin, of course, would have much rather Germany stay fragmented and divided and therefore weaker. He wants a weaker Germany that's not going to be able to rise up and invade the Soviet Union for a third time, that sort of thing. So that made him particularly angry. And, he's got his sort of communist bloc there in East Germany, but the western part of Berlin is still being controlled by democratic government. So you still have this division within division. So Berlin is divided amongst, with the Soviet section and then the British, French, and American section as well. So Stalin, angry over this and trying to unify Berlin under communist rule and under Soviet control, decides to try to push the British, French, and American-backed governments and support out of Berlin by blockading it. So in 1948, Stalin issues or decrees a Soviet blockade of Berlin. What does that mean if they're blockading it? They are blocking it off. They are saying we're closing all the roads. We're not allowing anybody in or out, and supplies. That supplies can't come in and out. No food, no medicine, no other medical supplies. We're just going to basically try to starve out the Allied-controlled parts of Berlin. Keeping in mind that at this point, for people of Berlin, if they don't get supplies and those kind of things from outside, they will likely starve to death because Berlin is in so many parts just piles of rubble. So this is potentially quite devastating. So restricting the road traffic, blocking off all the access, eventually even cutting power, so cutting electricity to parts of Berlin, trying to force the Allies out, trying to force the Allies, Britain, France, United States, to withdraw from the western portion of Berlin in order to allow the people of Berlin to survive and to lift that blockade. Well, Allies, led of course by the United States, not about to let that stop them, and so the American Allied solution to this blockade was to organize what became known as the Berlin Airlift, which lasted more than a year, beginning in 1948 and then going through May of 1949. So the idea here was, if we can't get supplies in by train, by vehicles and all of that, we will bring it in by air. So it was a massive undertaking to bring in supplies to Berlin, to give them everything that they needed, plus all of the conveniences of home, by bringing in hundreds and hundreds of flights daily into the city of Berlin. Thousands of tons a day of food products, whether they was meat, vegetables, whatever it was, agricultural products, clothing, medicine, other kinds of things for other rebuilding and construction and all that kind of stuff going on. Just bring it all in every day, thousands and thousands and thousands of flights. A massive undertaking and ultimately quite a successful one. So really quite a miraculous response to the blockade. And that results in 1949, the Soviets lift the blockade because it wasn't working because the United States was bringing in stuff by air. So what that means is certainly Berlin is not going to be consolidated into one city as Stalin had wanted. The Allies are going to, stick to, hold their ground and say we're not going to give up this part of the city. So it remains divided. And so throughout the entire Cold War, not only is Germany divided into two separate countries, but the city of Berlin is divided as well into East and West Berlin. And remember, that whole city, is within the communist bloc. It's in the communist portion of or Germany, in East Germany, but then you have this section of the city of Berlin that's not communist, and it's very odd kind of configuration. Eventually, you'll see things like Berlin Wall go up, but that doesn't happen until a little bit later. Because it's certainly, West Berliners were certainly big fans of the United States and big fans of the other allies after the Berlin Airlift, bringing them in all these supplies so that they can continue living their lives as normal while Stalin's trying to starve them out. But it just, again, furthers those tensions and further, kind of solidifies this Cold War, kind of further, makes that a very concrete thing that the United States and the Soviet Union don't want the same things and are willing to go to great lengths and even allowing Germany to be divided like this as a means of preserving their post-war vision and having control over their zones, control over their areas and all of that. Now, also what we will see, partially because it was, kind of the consensus after World War II, that there needed to be a greater sense of cooperation amongst countries, and the United States wanted and needed to be more engaged in world politics. And then also because of the growing Cold War, we see the United States doing something or being a part of some things in the years following World War II that would certainly not have been done prior to this. And that is building up permanent alliances, including military alliances, with multiple foreign nations, something that the United States had historically stayed away from and had historically kind of felt was not a good idea, not something they wanted to be a part of. One of these we've kind of already mentioned, and we're not going into huge detail about these organizations and how they work, just kind of looking at them as examples of the United States, one, being more engaged in the world in a post-World War II world, and also how these were in some way symbolic of the Cold War and motivated by the Cold War. The first is the United Nations, which created in 1945. This is the one, again, we've talked about before. This is the, successor to the League of Nations. It's the same sort of concept that we had with the League of Nations after World War I, where every nation would be represented, and an international organization that is dedicated to peace and security, that's trying to enhance peace and security for the world, where member nations can be represented, the idea being to have more transparency, to try to reach agreements and have more open diplomacy so that there will be less war and, less violent confrontations and less secrecy and all that sort of stuff. So it's the exact same basic idea that you have at the League of Nations. This is something that Roosevelt felt very adamant about. We talked about how they were already laying plans for this before the war was even over. So this wasn't necessarily motivated by the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was involved in it. Now, there are some things, again, I'm not going to ask you don't need to know exactly how the UN works, but it does have more, its structure is different than the League of Nations. It's got more teeth to it, basically. It can take stronger action than the League of Nations could. There's more differences in how it is set up. You've got a General Assembly and then a Security Council, so it kind of has a different structure that makes it a bit more effective. So we will see the UN become a part of that, Cold War dynamic of sometimes it's not just the United States acting alone, but with UN allies or acting with NATO allies. NATO was created in 1949. This one more motivated by the Cold War than let's all be happy and not cause another war again. NATO stands for, that's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but we usually just call it NATO. Nobody ever walks around talking about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They just say NATO. NATO is a military alliance that the United States has with many or several European countries. This is with most of Western Europe. It originally included 12 nations. You don't need to know exactly which ones they were, and there's more now. NATO still exists. So, of course, the usual suspects, Britain and France and all of that. But with the Cold War congealing, solidifying, and that becoming more of a concern, that the Soviet Union was trying to expand communism and we have to stand up against this communist threat and all of that, that motivates the creation of something like NATO, that we all, these Western democratic countries, have got to work together, band together, make an alliance with each other, originally to stand against the Soviet Union and the communist bloc and all of that, to be on, a military alliance on our side of the so-called Iron Curtain and all of that. And they are agreeing pretty much that are, not in an incredibly binding way, but agreeing that if one of them is attacked, then what would they consider that? Yeah, attack on all of them. So there have been and we will talk very soon about military engagements that the United States has been involved in post World War II that may have been UN actions. They could have been, something that was being done by UN nations, although the United States might have supplied more of the troops and such, but they may have been done with United States allies or some that were NATO led. So it was United States and NATO allies. So we see the United States definitely coming or moving far, far, far away from that very isolated, non-involved, kind of aloof, great neutral kind of power, and certainly after post-World War II, partially out of a desire and kind of a recognition that was needed, but also out of these Cold War tensions. We see the United States getting far more involved in making permanent alliances and committing itself to various actions through the UN or NATO and other organizations that are tied to the UN, like World Health Organization and stuff like that. Okay, so that finishes that first bit. Well, we didn't get done yesterday. Any questions so far on that?